Dwarf star novas, record snow, crop losses, Neanderthals eating entire snakes, inland seas forming in Australia, inland seas forming across the Middle East yet again. Wow. Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum. In the media, overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output, but very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time: cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the grand solar minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David Dubine. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on this planet. Mini novas from dwarf stars, delayed planting, record cold in Europe, Australia turning into an inland sea, the Middle East turning into an inland sea, record rains wherever you look. Welcome to today's show. I'm your host, David Dubine, Mini Ice Age Conversations podcast. Revolution Radio Studio A, 10 p.m. to midnight every Thursday. I also can be found on YouTube, Adapt 2030, because we need to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 to deal with this new intensifying grand solar minimum. This show is about how to see the signs that are changing into a cyclical pattern of solar activity that we haven't seen in at least 400 years. How it's going to affect crop production, food prices, the economy, and how you can keep your families safe. And as we've seen through this last week of intensification yet again, it seems like every time I start a show, I keep saying the same thing. Unprecedented, unbelievable, amplification, never seen anything like this, and it just continues week upon week. So I wanted to start off by food pricing today. Take a look at what's happening so you can forecast out literally what's going to happen with the crop pricing. Now, some of you are into the futures market, some of you just watch it. Others of you are completely unaware of what's happening in terms of the food production in the United States and Europe at the moment, as well as Australia. Now, the record cold in Australia this year dented into what would have been the harvest season, because coming to the end of the summer down there, going into winter as we in the Northern Hemisphere go into our summer, the crops are already up, ready to harvest, and they had massive 100-mile-per-hour winds, all-time record cold temperatures in Western Australia, hailstorms, floods, right on top of the crop growing zone in Western Australia. So what they were booking in and saying, oh, it's going to be a record harvest this year, you're going to have to rethink that a little bit. Let's take a look at what is happening in the U.S. Late season wild weather, delayed planting yet again. And I'm thinking, how many times can we have this record delayed planting? Because what the farmers are going to have to do is in the northeast, northwest, Canadian border area. But this year, the winter is the longest ever recorded in the crop growing zones, at least since they've been keeping records in terms of, now, you got to realize, still going to have a very difficult time getting in and planting. They're going to have to rush the planting, and it's going to be wet. And two things seeds do not like when they're going to germinate is cold soil and wet. That's a bad combo for anything you want to grow. And understanding that these seismic and volcanic events are cyclical, and you'll want to check out upheaval, why catastrophic earthquakes will soon strike the United States. Leading experts in the geophysical effects of climate change make a strong case for a link between the sun's cycles of behavior with highly destructive earthquakes. The authors explain that when the sun goes into reduced energy phase, a grand solar minimum as we're entering right now, it produces colder weather and the worst earthquakes across the historical timelines. Included are easy-to-understand charts and graphs showing that we face an imminent threat. Find out the status of the threat for California, Alaska, South Carolina, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and many other states and regions across our planet. And if you want to support this broadcast, click the link in the description box below to Upheaval: Why Catastrophic Earthquakes Will Soon Strike the United States, available in both paperback and Kindle versions. And we saw the same thing last year. And then after the planting, it's going to be incredibly wet. It'll be muddy like we saw last year. Now, the bombogenesis that rolled through the middle of the United States, dumping record rains in Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, and then that swept down the river and inundated and flooded all the grain storage facilities all the way down the Mississippi, clear into Louisiana. Those areas also that received the record rains are still like an inland sea up in parts of Nebraska and Iowa. They're not going to be able to plant. The latest count is about 4 million acres that's not going to be planted this year due to either the loss of the roads and the infrastructure to get to the fields, and also just the cleanup that has to go on to be able to get those fields back to where they were. If you ever watch Feeder Flash, Corbett Wall's channel, he works with DV Auctions, and they go through the different poultry and meats and cattle and pig, and he gives reports about the conditions that are in the heartland, if you will, the main crop growing areas of America. He's saying the same thing, that the amount of work that it's going to take to refurbish the fields after all the flooding, not only that, but the amount of pesticides, herbicides like Roundup, that kind of stuff, those Roundup ready GMO seeds, there were millions and millions and millions of gallons of that broke loose and just flooded all the fields. So if they're not planting a GM crop, they're not going to be able to plant in these fields. The soil's so contaminated with chemical as well as with, like I say, these herbicides that kill off other plants. So if you're not with the target species, you're still not going to be able to plant in the field because the Roundup is going to kill everything else off that's not Roundup ready or Roundup hardy. So the U.S. is facing a gamut of problems trying to get the fields restored, and this is starting to drive up the prices. Now, after the grain debacle and the massive floods that wiped away about 38% of all stored grain in America, you think the futures markets would have priced that in, but they didn't. They held it down for the last couple, 2-3 weeks. They even put a premium on buying contracts for corn. It was about a 35-cent premium. That was to try to dissuade anybody from jumping in on the corn longs, just because they knew everybody was going to jump in. So they were successful in the first 2 to 2.5 weeks to suppress the prices, but now it's starting to tick up. And everywhere you look, if you're out there, spring wheat is a definite winner this year. Not investment advice, but the way you look at the massive floods right across the spring wheat growing zones, when it come down July, somewhere when they're usually getting toward to really understand what's happening in the fields, I bet we'll see a huge price spike. And I do a dabbling here and there in the options market, and that's one of the contracts that I'm holding out is delivery for spring wheat. I feel it's going to take a battering and a tattering in the total amount of spring wheat going to be available in the U.S. So that's just a random thing to throw out there. Long story short, food prices are going up. And everybody on my YouTube channel, if you follow my YouTube channel, Adapt 2030, and also Christian Westbrook over at Ice Age Farmer, we routinely cover the crop losses that are occurring because of this new grand solar minimum. Now, Diamond up at Oppenheimer Ranch Project also delves into that a little bit, but he's more on the mechanisms and the news just feed following all the changes. We're both seeing the same things here. Everybody that's writing us every day now is talking about food price rises, or how small things are, or the inavailability. Now they're just straight up putting signs up that said, due to supply constraints, this is no longer available. There should be a wake-up call for every shopper out there. If you're going into a supermarket, I encourage you this week, I know you're going to go to the store at least sometime, even if you are prepping, still time to get out there and get some rice, beans, canned goods, bulk goods at a cheaper price right now. By the end of the year, this stuff's going to start rising, and by next year, this is kind of the last year you have to really start getting ready for foodstuffs. I encourage you to buy an enormous amount of candles, lighters. After reading 1 Year in Hell, the accounts of the Bosnian War, I cannot stress to you highly enough cans of butane and lighters, antibiotics, and candles, along with bullets. These are the things that were traded most highly. And then water filtration as well. You can set up your own water filter just using some charcoal, some grass, sand, and coarse rock. That'll filter it. It won't purify it. But then at that point, you're going to have to boil it to get it purified. So any of these things that you can do to make your life easier in terms of water filtration or any kind of water purification, because I know it tastes horrible when you throw those chlorine tabs in there. Or if you're able to get chlorine and different types of things to be able to treat water. This is one of the main things in duress situations was these people in Bosnia were completely cut off instantly. They were told, the governments back in the day, you got to realize we're going back into the 1990s here. Slobodan Milosevic, those kind of days, Bosnia, Herzegovina, these wars. So anyway, they were cut off. They're in the cities. They were telling everybody, hey, it's all good. Hey, it's all good. We're working it out. No problem. Nothing to worry about. Go back to work. It's safe. And within 4 days, the cities were sieged and blockaded with snipers everywhere. So the whole account is this one guy's personal account and his family on how they bonded together to keep their street safe as a safe zone, and how they had to trade for things and what was the most valuable during these times. Come back to today, all around the world, the governments continue to assure us that everything's good, the food's good, crops are here, no war, everything's going to be fine, economy's intact, keep going to work, save for your retirement in 40 years, because you know what? Stability is the name of the narrative media game today. And global warming, by the way. So if you put those two together. Now, reading the accounts in the Bosnian War, I see some of the same similarities in terms of the media is in overdrive at the moment to assure us that everything will remain stable. Now, if you haven't noticed that, please consciously notice how the media is continuously, nearly every article now, about stability in some way, shape, or form, of things that are going to remain stable. It always has been stable, and it will always remain stable. Notice that, consciously notice it, and then see how they're weaving these articles in. Secondly, the amount of global warming articles is at literally an all-time high that I have ever seen, all pushed out in the same time. Over the last month, there has been an enormous uptick in the amount of global warming articles, just reassuring you that global warming's here. Everything from regurgitating articles in 2008 that are no longer valid because of all the new science has come out and all the new data, satellites, etc., to prove and show us once and for all that a lot of that hype in the global warming narrative is not really happening. So again, it's the same thing that happened in Bosnia. Everything's fine, everything's fine, everything's fine. Don't worry about it. Everything's fine. Right up until that very last minute where it wasn't fine. And even in that very last day, and this was the thing that was the most shocker. This guy, he went into a very detailed account about the run-up to their duress situation. And he was like, even in the last 12 hours, right before the siege started and the blockade started, they still told us they were going to be able to work it out. Within 12 hours, everything collapsed. But the media assured everybody to the very last second that it was going to be okay, and it sure wasn't. All these global warming articles coming out are in direct opposition to the amount of flood, the tidal wave of news coming out about record everything across the planet that's happening that's completely out of season. Completely out of season. Everything's in an extreme Uber. Every weather report you read is, I never saw anything like this before, ever, unprecedented, ever, every record being broken. Snows, ice, hail, cold, and some heat along the way. I want to go into that today too. The record Easter warmth in England, they missed 1949, so I don't know how that could be a record hot Easter Sunday when 1949 was actually 3 degrees Celsius warmer, but somehow magically missed. I guess they didn't do their homework or research when they put that report out. It was so convenient for the satellite record. 1979 forward, yeah, but going back to 49, no. So again, you know what's in the news? Everything's to reassure you that global warming continues. You need to continue to be afraid. You need to continue to believe it's CO2 and there's no other mechanisms at work at all. Don't even think about it. The all-time record cosmic ray densities that were just reached last week, all-time ever, highest ever recorded cosmic ray density, like how many cosmic rays are pelting our atmosphere. Is it a high? All-time ever recorded, that's why there's more clouds. But nope, that has nothing to do with anything happening with the record rains. It's all CO2. All this record cold and record snow that you're seeing, it's because of CO2 also. The record heat, well, supposedly record heat, has to be obviously because it's CO2, obviously. The record winds and out-of-season storms, everything 2 months behind in different planting seasons across Asia. We'll go into a crop report here in Asia too. The rains have gone away. Same in Africa, the monsoon's different. Oh, CO2. Absolutely. CO2 is affecting the jet streams, the monsoon patterns. Wouldn't happen to be anything with the intertropical convergence zone as it shifts on its 400 or 1,000 or 6,000 year pattern as it has through history. Nope, couldn't be that. No, got to be CO2. Couldn't be a natural cycle. Nope, has to be CO2. And you see every single article that comes out counters every single extreme weather report or reports of mixed up weather, wrong seasonal events happening. As soon as that's reported in the news, there's 6 articles behind it about global warming to say that's CO2, don't worry about it, it's normal, it's all CO2, pay more tax. And I'm starting to notice the trend that now see here, this thing, every time we're getting one of these extreme weather reports coming out, specifically when it's snow or cold, it's immediately be followed by a plethora of articles CO2 based. So, obviously proves global warming. The all-time record cold in the Ural Mountain delaying planting over in Russia. Obviously CO2. You didn't know that? Delayed planting, 25 degrees Celsius, which is about 32 to 35 Fahrenheit below normal temperatures in the Ural Mountains. You know, that article comes out once, runs through the media for the day, and then they move on. Well, the mainstream media needs to back it up, backstop, and roll in for an entire week to get you to not feel and not observe your own senses. Now what I see here is the entire global corporate media trying to gaslight us as a society. They're literally at the point asking you and trying to Pavlov dog you with CO2 articles into not believing your own sixth sense or your own eyes. This is what is happening. Do you feel something's wrong at the moment? Well, the media is assuring you that everything's correct. That is normal. So now instead of deflecting away and saying it's CO2, so again, we're almost getting into June. 2 weeks before June and record snow and record cold. Assure you, watch for this in the media. They're going to say that it's normal. And they're going to pull out a bevy of articles finding one other instance back in time somewhere to show that this random middle of May snows and record cold. It's normal. It happened before. It happens all the time. Didn't you know that? Global warming, it was supposed to happen. Notice how they switched the narrative from global warming should have warmed our planet into global warming is causing record cold. And you know what? We had always forecast, even back in the 1990s, when Al Gore said snow would be a thing of the past, your children will never know what snow is, that the middle of May snows and record cold, that was forecast in the global warming models. Didn't you know that? You weren't paying attention in class. Hailstorms. I want to talk about hail for a second here. This is one of the things that in the last grand solar minimums, the Maunder minimum, the Sporer minimum, and the Wolf minimum. These are the last 3 known grand solar minimums that were heavy in intensity. Maunder minimum, Wolf minimum, Sporer minimum. That's S-P-O-R-E-R. They talked about the size of the hail pummeling villages that were made of wood, homes, into the ground so deeply that when the storms subsided and receded, that you never knew a town existed there. Multi-pound hailstones, killing people, killing farm animals, and pummeling houses, like I say, splintering them to the point where they were buried in the mud. Now, what are the chances 2 times in 2 different countries that people are killed by hail and hospitalized by hail? Zhejiang province, wild wind and hail batters students in Zhejiang province in China. That's in the East Coast, south of Shanghai. And Xiamen's right there too, with Fuzhou as the capital of that province. I'm thinking about going down toward Zhejiang, getting down toward Fuzhou, this coastal area. This is what I'm talking about here. Battered. These students were injured by hail. I couldn't believe when I read the article because down in Uganda, they had 13 people killed by hail. Literally, the hail busted through the roofs of these homes and actually killed people in their homes. And when they ran out to just get away from all the hail crushing their homes, they were knocked unconscious, and they had more than 100 people treated for hail injuries in Uganda. So here we go. Wenzhou, that's right at the edge of, right after Fuzhou. If you come up out of Fujian province, right at the edge of the Zhejiang province. That's where those two provinces connect right there. This is where it seems that this event took place. Students were waiting in line also for a job fair, and they were hospitalized after serious injuries, bruises, cuts. 5 students here went to the hospital, and then a plethora of other talking about injuries, and they didn't go to the hospital, but black and blue marks on their bodies. Looked like somebody, I don't know, hit them with a baseball bat several times. Person with an umbrella, the wind velocity was so fast that somebody was holding an umbrella and it yanked them off the ground, literally like a kite, if you're going to go kiteboarding, and then slammed them into the ground and then pounded them with hail, and this person was hospitalized. And then at the job fair, when they were outside, they had these plastic stools, you see them all over the place. Students picked them up to cover their heads, and the hail was so damaging that it cracked those plastic stools and then looks like crushed some of their fingers and damaged their fingers, and it looks like black and blue welts on their hands as they were trying to block themselves from the hailstones. But the hail was so ferocious that it was bouncing off the ground, slamming into their shins. And then we had the same thing where it was killing people over in Uganda. So what's tracking on this grand solar minimum intensification? These hail events are increasing in size and intensity. So what we're seeing now, remember the biggest events aren't even going to be here until, I'm going to say 2021 is when we'll really start to feel the effects, and then rolling into 2023, 24, the world's literally going to flip upside down in terms of weather, where the workings of our societies are going to start to split apart at that point. I would say by the end of 2021, the workings of our daily lives are going to be so different that they're going to truly be affected by everything taking place in terms of the atmosphere behaving differently, where the consciousness of all humans will be ignited and wake up at that point. So it's going to be very difficult for the governments of the world to maintain an economy when people are knowing that next year is not going to be good. That's why I think there's this push right now in the media to assure everybody that everything's stable. Because here's what I've been writing a couple articles. And the way I'm trying to put it down is, governments of the world understand what's happening, and they are trying themselves to stockpile and prepare for what they term continuity of government, meaning that they're stockpiling their underground bunkers and whatever facilities they have, underground bases, hardened facilities, anything they have, they are preparing, buying, stockpiling. So when it gets really bad, they're going to pull back into their forts, lock themselves in, and try to ride this thing out for several years, and try to maintain a government from their bunkers or from their facilities, while the rest of the populace sits out here in no man's land with all these weather events. Because you got to realize, these hardened bunkers that they have, they can withstand nuclear blasts, tornadoes, typhoons, hurricanes, whatever. For that, there's nothing inside them. They'll ride it out. They'll sleep overnight, won't even know a hurricane passed over. That's how well built these things are. So you got to think, if you're a government or many governments in the world, and you're trying to stockpile right now, would you alert the world populace to all these changing weather events? Because you would realize and understand that these 7.5 billion people are going to try to buy the same supplies that you need right now for continuity of government, and that'll just leave shortages everywhere. So would you use the media to deflect all these changes until the very last second, where it's no longer deflectable and people no longer believe the media, corporate media, in terms of why these changes are happening? They are happening. And at that point, people really start to get ready on their own. And whatever the media says, the corporate global style media, people will just not even listen, and they'll go out and start to do their own thing just because of what they see around them. But for right now, I'm very finally convinced, absolutely, that there is a ploy to keep us unprepared so others can prepare. Is it nefarious? Absolutely yes. Is it dishonest? Beyond words to be dishonest. Is it a cull of the human population? Absolutely it is. I mean, if they haven't warned us by now, they're absolutely planning on getting the most loss of life they possibly can out of this, because when we come back out of it, less people means they can restart the debt economy. Less people means their military, since they're going to be so well armed, so well fed, strong, and the rest of us out here will be, growing and coming up with innovative solutions. But you read through again the Maunder minimum, the Sporer minimum, the Wolf minimum. Just the general population got weaker because the amount of available food and protein wasn't there.